Distinguished delegates here at COP26 Glasgow and attendees worldwide, welcome to our side event, Multi-Level Action for Biodiversity and Climate, Planetary Challenge, and Lessons from Latin America. This is a cross-sectoral exchange on joint policy, practice, and research for nature, climate, and people. My name is Edil Boran, Associate Professor at York University in Canada, and lead researcher at the Synergies of Planetary Health Research Initiative based at the Dadale Institute for Global Health Research, and I serve as Associate Director of CFAL York, a UN-affiliated leadership training for knowledge exchange, capacity building hub at York University. This side event is a partnership between York University, Canada, Grantham Institute Climate Change and the Environment at Imperial College London, the Society for Wildlife Research and Environmental Education, SPVS, Brazil, Boticário Group Foundation, and OroVerde Tropical Forest Foundation, and in collaboration with the German Development Institute and Defensores de la Naturaleza. This is part of a series of dialogues that we are holding and follows a pre-COP26 knowledge exchange we held online at York University in October with our partners who are here today with us at this side event. We have a great side event for you today, and I now invite Dr. Sander Chan, Senior Researcher at the Global Center on Adaptation and lead partner here at this project. Sander, you will be moderating. Thank you for being here. You have the floor.
Thank you, Edil, and good morning to all, good day for our viewers online. I have the great pleasure to introduce to you today our discussion and to be your moderator. So today we will talk about multi-level action for biodiversity and climate. The growth of non-state and local action in global biodiversity and climate governance is remarkable. With every climate summit, we see more engagement, for instance, through partnerships and cooperative initiatives. About 300 cooperative initiatives are currently registered throughout the UN system, engaging more than 40,000 businesses, investors, cities and regions, and civil society organizations. And among these are 99 nature-based climate actions that engage at least 5,000 actors. Now, the mitigation potential of this non-state and local engagement is much greater than all countries' pledges combined. So this is quite remarkable. The full implementation of just 19 large-scale, high mitigation potential initiatives alone could theoretically set us on a 2 degrees pathway by 2030. But non-state engagement could also help us buck the trend of biodiversity loss. So it's no wonder that both climate and biodiversity governance are converging on the idea of mobilizing more non-state and local actors. But let's not get carried away here. We need to know who is participating, who is benefiting from these actions. For instance, despite the rhetoric, we see relatively low private sector engagement in nature-based climate actions. And also worrying is the fact that most funders and lead partners of non-state actions are based in the global north, even when they implement in developing countries. So we need to ask ourselves, do they really benefit those who are most affected? And finally, do these non-state actors deliver what they promise? In our research project, we collect data on whether non-state actors produce the outputs that fit with their goals and targets. And what we, for instance, find is that nature-based climate actions are underperforming compared to climate mitigation actions. And the recent COVID-19 pandemic also hit nature-based climate action much harder than mitigation actions. So all of this raises key issues that we need to discuss. First, how do we realize the full potential of climate adaptation, and biodiversity action? And second, how can we ensure that non-state participation is both broad and equitable? Third, how do we make sure that benefits do accrue to developing countries and the most affected communities? And finally, how can we improve nature-based climate action as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic? Here to discuss these key issues, we have an excellent panel featuring perspectives from policy, research, and on the ground. But before I introduce you to them, I would like to invite our webcast audience to post questions and comments on Twitter using the hashtag biodivCC. We will feature your question as well as those of our audience here in Glasgow in the Q&A later. So let me introduce you to our first panelists. Alexandra Depré is a research fellow at IDDRI. Not only has she supported the French presidency during COP21 in the development of the transparency framework, she also worked as a negotiator at COP23 and 24, and you have also been part of the Paris Agreement rulebook negotiations for Costa Rica. And we're very glad to have you because you are really one of the leading voices, I would say, for aligning biodiversity and climate ambition. So, Alexandra, what are your key challenges what would you say are the key challenges in achieving meaningful action on biodiversity and climate?
Thank you so much, Sander, for this invitation to speak. And so I guess, yes, I think meaningful action on climate change and biodiversity needs to be thought really in the light of how we reach the 1.5 goal, at least here in this arena. And that's why today I wanted to focus on that. And I think that precisely a challenge to achieving meaningful actual action is ensuring that climate action towards the 1.5 goal is truly underpinned and aligned with biodiversity and ecosystem planetary boundaries. So, yes, so I would argue that climate ambition really needs to be redefined or further defined. I mean, we need to reach the Paris Agreement 1.5 goal and mid-century net zero, but within really keeping within ecosystem planetary limits, obviously, so in a way that we help reverse rather than accelerate the biodiversity crisis we're also facing. And so to have a comprehensive view of these linkages between climate and biodiversity, we need to focus on today on action both on unprecedented conservation of ecosystems that exist today, so namely to preserve the key carbon sink that they represent, but at the same time we need to do this in parallel and not instead of deep decarbonization across the whole economy so that we can ensure that reaching net zero, to reach net zero, we do not depend on massive net. And so in other words, the, I guess, logical conclusion is that ensuring healthy ecosystems into the future not only depends on nature conservation, but also on ambitious emissions reductions today. So this is just quickly a slide showing from the IPCC 1.5 special report in 2018, showing precisely that we have supposedly different ways, different ways of reaching net zero emissions, depending more on the net or on the zero. And I guess recent research shows that, assess that 97% of these 1.5 or 2 degree scenarios exceed what the authors call a precautionary threshold value of land area used for bioenergy crops. And this is because many of these pathways that are presented by the IPCC modelers depend on massive BECCS, so bioenergy with carbon capture and storage deployment, as a form of carbon dioxide removal. And so the authors of this paper really insists that large-scale BECCS and its associated land use could likely steer the Earth system closer to or beyond planetary boundaries associated with freshwater use, biosphere integrity, and biochemical flows. So this all points to the real necessity to ensure that, to really question like the integrity and the viability of some of these pathways. And of course, the P4 pathway was presented as a pathway to 1.5 that has a large overshoot, so it's not considered even by the IPCC. IPCC is not policy prescriptive, but they presented it there to show the risk to land use and ecosystems if we have that. But even though we really need to question the viability of other pathways that still use way too much bioenergy. So the IPCC AR6 Working Group 3 report will look more into the other potential of other types of CDR, but even in terms of land carbon sinks, there is recent research showing that we have been perhaps over-promising, focusing on nature-based solutions, and this really has to come we can't let this focus on nature come at the expense, reduce the pressure on companies and countries to reduce their emissions, because that is first. And of course, as you must have heard, the Secretary General of the UN really insisted on the need to have net zero integrity. And so I think this panel today, focusing on keeping companies, non-state actors, accountable to their promises towards net zero is really essential. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And next, I have the pleasure to introduce you to Professor Andy Purvis, and he's a researcher at the Natural History Museum and affiliate at Grantham Institute. Andy is a world-leading expert on modeling of local terrestrial biodiversity responses to human impacts. And Andy is with us today to share some insights on measuring and predicting progress on biodiversity action. I hand it over to you, Andy.
Thank you very much indeed, Sander, and thanks very much for the opportunity. So I've entitled this talk, Monitoring, Modeling and Making It to the Future, because basically we're currently in the air, in a plane. We've got a very narrow landing strip. We're not exactly confident of how to get there. I'm going to argue that monitoring and modeling of biodiversity and climate together are really important as an integrated strategy for getting us there, helping us land the plane safely, and that although all of the tools, all of the science, all of the partnerships can deepen and improve and enrich, they are not what's limiting progress. We have enough to make a perfectly good start now. So I want to start with the point that yes, climate change is what's brought everybody here, but the biodiversity crisis is at least partly a separate crisis. Climate change is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss, the sort of 5 horsemen of the apocalypse, if you like. But if you rescale these circles by how important they are currently, oh, that didn't work at all. Okay, so what should happen there is that the circles change in size in proportion to their importance. In which case what you see is 2 circles become very much bigger than all the others. Land and sea use change is the main driver of global biodiversity loss. Direct exploitation is second, and in the oceans it's most important. Climate change doesn't even get a medal in these driver Olympics. It finishes 4th, though it does get the silver medal in the oceans. Now that's set to change over the coming decades, and climate change will join the others, but they're not going away. So we need solutions to climate that don't exacerbate land use pressures, as Alexandra was saying. So when we're preventing runaway climate change, to bend the curve of biodiversity loss, we have to do it in a way that conserves and restores habitat, regenerating nature, rather than cashing in nature to try and allow us to continue to burn fossil fuels or whatever. We also need less consumption. We generally need to manage our ecosystems in ways that help us to bend the curve. It really isn't rocket science. And I want to emphasize that. It is exactly not rocket science that we need to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. But we do need models, because in order to bend the curve, we need to know whether the actions we're planning to do are enough. And that is a modeling question. But we also then need monitoring in order to check that our models, which are still nascent, they're much less well developed than climate models, are on target. And so the modeling and the monitoring must work hand in hand. So here there is a role for rocket science, because satellite data can provide high intensity of data, high objectivity, repeatability, and precision of what you can see from that far away. But you need to supplement it with actually sampling. You can sample with environmental DNA, which tells you what lives in the area, but also you're going to need more precise actual sampling of organisms through these sorts of monitoring methods, so that you can link these things up. You can ground truth what you can sense from space, what you can sense with light touch environmental DNA sampling. You can ground truth that against what ecological communities actually contain. Can't skimp on it. And then the models can use site survey data like that together with information on how those, the level of pressures and the nature of pressures that those sites face. So these are sites in the PREDICTS database, which my group has put together. And we model how biodiversity responds to threats using data from over 40,000 sites worldwide and nearly 60,000 species now. So that's 2.5% as many species as have been formally described, and that means that it's telling us about broad sense biodiversity, not just a single group. When we do that, we're able to estimate one of the indicators in the planetary boundaries framework that Alexandra mentioned, the Biodiversity Intactness Index. What fraction of natural biodiversity is still left on average? Here, the darker the better. And so Suriname, for instance, almost totally intact. Right, so unfortunately, all of the animations have gone a bit awry. So on the right, it shows something from the NHM's Biodiversity Trends Explorer, which the QR code also links to, highlighting a couple of countries that have both seen troubling times for biodiversity recently, Brazil and El Salvador. But although Brazil has lost about 8 percentage points of its biodiversity intactness index over 50 years, it is still way above the UK. It has done so much better a job at retaining its biodiversity than the UK. And we have to bear that in mind, that the biodiversity intactness is often very much higher in developing world and in tropics generally, and Latin America as well, than in a lot of the developed north. So I've argued that monitoring and models together provide us with a chance to land a plane safely. We can fairly compare nature across different regions, but we need the monitoring to tell us whether we're going to need course corrections in order to land this plane, because we really do need to land this plane safely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was better than rocket science. Next, we have a contribution by our colleague Ricardo Borges. He's Executive Director of the SPVS Brazil, which is a Society for Wildlife Research and Environmental Education. Ricardo will take us on a journey through the Brazilian Atlantic Forest Great Reserve to show us how we can align actions that support biodiversity, climate, and people. Please, can we have the video up?
Hi, my name is Ricardo Borges, and I work as a marketing and networking manager for the Atlantic Forest Great Reserve Initiative in Brazil. It is undeniable the importance of our country in fighting global climate change, especially for its vast natural patrimony. The Atlantic forest is a tropical rainforest that stretches along the coast of Brazil and into the continent as far as Paraguay. It is one of the most biodiverse biomes in the world, with a large number of species of animals and plants and a high rate of endemism, species that only occur in this region and nowhere else in the world. It is also very important for local cultures, since the country was formed within these landscapes and most of the population still lives in its domains. After hundreds of years of degradation, this World Heritage Site has been reduced to just 7% of its original coverage. Between the south and southeast of Brazil, in the states of São Paulo, Paraná, and Santa Catarina, is the largest well-preserved continuum of Atlantic forest in the world, composed of 2.2 million hectares of terrestrial ecosystems and 1.8 million hectares of marine area. This place is known as the Atlantic Forest Great Reserve, a mosaic with over 110 protected areas across 50 municipalities in 3 states. It is home for more than 1 million Brazilians, traditional communities, and also endangered species like the southern muriqui and the red-tailed Amazon. Located in one of the most urbanized regions in the entire country, the initiative represents the rare opportunity to rewrite history, proving that the best development model is one that prioritizes people's quality of life and the maintenance of the local natural and cultural heritage. This context fits perfectly into the full nature framework. The concept considers that large areas that are still well protected offer the opportunity for a spectacle, featuring the diversity of species, breathtaking landscapes, authentic cultures, and much more. These increasingly valued products generate the opportunity for a restorative economy, based on entrepreneurship that preserve and also profit from nature conservation. Therefore, the Atlantic Forest Great Reserve represents a fruitful place for businesses with a positive environmental and social impact. This economic model benefits society as a whole, and is focused on ensuring the quality of life, especially in local rural communities, offering opportunities for young people to stay with their families. In turn, communities are the greatest allies, being guardians of this heritage, ensuring its long-term conservation and closing the full nature virtual cycle. Thus, the Atlantic Forest Great Reserve represents many things, including a preeminent international nature tourism destination, a replicable and innovative development model, and a vast natural and cultural world heritage, which is also an important green infrastructure to combat climate change. The success of this initiative is directly related to the governance and decision-making structure, which has actions perfectly aligned with a solid bottom-up network strategy. The stakeholders network started with just 8 members from 2 municipalities at the end of 2018, and today has over 400 members from almost every municipality across the 3 states. Based on a collective impact approach, the initiative promotes a voluntary and collaborative environment where any person, company, or institution is invited to participate as long as they are interested in thriving together. All the decisions are taken collectively, and the progress is recorded and published. This approach is very important for policymaking, to identify needs for investments, to disseminate good examples, and, above all, to stimulate and strengthen the sum of efforts between states, cities, entrepreneurs, and communities. This way, nature conservation and local cultures become part of a shared vision for this entire region. The Atlantic Forest Great Reserve is a work in progress, and it was inspired in consolidated initiatives, especially in Argentina and Chile. Therefore, this model can also be replicated in other regions of Brazil, Latin America, and worldwide.
So it's very early in Brazil, but I know that Ricardo is following us. And thank you, Ricardo, for this amazing trip. So let me take this opportunity to remind our audience online to post their comments and questions on Twitter using the hashtag biodivcc as we move on to discuss the business case for biodiversity and climate action. So engagement by businesses is becoming more and more important in both climate and biodiversity governance. But how can we make sure that there's a business case for conservation and climate change adaptation? With me here is André Ferretti, who is a Senior Manager for Business and Biodiversity at Boticário Group Foundation in Brazil. You have brought with you a video presentation on this topic. Could you briefly introduce us to the video?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. The challenges we face today require joint efforts, as they cannot be overcome and isolated by a single actor. We would like to see strong collective actions, and what we are showing here is a movement where in Brazil, where we are working together with companies, people, agricultures, local governments, and everybody that live in an area about 30,000 hectares, where we are collecting water to supply water for all the Curitiba metropolitan area, and producing food for people that live in that region, and we will see in the video now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, André.
Water security has become an important issue worldwide. In 2019, Boticário Group Foundation idealized the Viva Agua initiative, which catalyzes multiple stakeholders toward water security and climate change adaptation. Before providing you further details on this initiative, I'll explain how it was conceived. For over 30 years, Boticário Group Foundation has been carrying out and supporting nature conservation in Brazil. The foundation is maintained by Boticário Group, a Brazilian organization which belongs to the beauty segment, and that goes from the industry to the store. Boticário Group is present in 15 other countries and leads the largest network of cosmetics franchises in the world. In 2018, the foundation started to develop a strategy to connect the dependencies of Brazilian businesses to positive impact on biodiversity. We started by evaluating the closest scenario, our own business. The truth is that any industry needs to look at these two topics. First, to measure and reduce impacts on biodiversity, and second, to invest in nature conservation so that the resources and services nature provides continue available. Here, we'll talk specifically about water, a resource on which absolutely everyone depends. Promoting water security is a challenge that cannot be fought by only one organization. Multiple partnerships are required. In light of this context, the Viva Agua initiative was launched in 2019 to transform the socio-economic and environmental reality of the Miringuava Basin through actions that contribute to water security. And why was this region chosen? It supplies water to over 600 people, not only in the municipality to which it belongs, but also to several neighboring ones. This region belongs to a municipality which has the second largest GDP in the state, with many farmers and industries depending on water to keep the economy moving. That's why Viva Agua initiative established two working approaches. First, to promote conservation and restoration of natural areas. This approach will fight the high sedimentation levels of the rivers within the basin, which compromise water quality and quantity. And second, to foster impact investing, mainly focusing on sustainable agriculture and responsible tourism. During the first year of Viva Agua, one of our partners, ProAdapta, pointed out that an essential goal for water security was still missing: climate change adaptation. Climate change can be an aggravating factor in water availability, influencing both its quantity and quality. Therefore, I'll highlight this specific partnership, even though we have partners from several sectors. ProAdapta is a project commissioned by the German government, which in partnership with the Brazilian Ministry of Environment is supporting the implementation of the Brazilian Agenda for Climate Change Adaptation. This partnership has been very important in the inclusion of climate risks into the strategies of Viva Agua, helping us to implement measures for climate change adaptation. As a 10-year initiative, Viva Agua will bring multiple benefits to different stakeholders. That's why we also need the active engagement of companies. This engagement process is based on their water dependence and is also an opportunity for climate change adaptation through collective action at territorial level. The partnership with ProAdapta is helping us to engage with the private sector by different means. We developed a study to evaluate the benefits of nature-based solutions for water and climate resilience, which has strengthened the engagement with the local water agency. Through this partnership, we are also working with 3 local companies to develop a strategy to manage climate risks, which also include ecosystem-based adaptation. Together, we undertook a cost-benefit analysis of all the climate change adaptation actions planned by Viva Agua, which is helping us to raise awareness on nature-based solutions among different players. By integrating the goal of climate change adaptation, Viva Agua has built its actions on 4 pillars: nature conservation, water security, climate change adaptation, and impact investing. The model was conceived to be replicated in other regions. However, it is crucial to keep the focus on nature conservation, as nature and balance is the foundation for socio-economic development. To learn more about this and other initiatives idealized by Boticário Group Foundation, please access the address on the screen.
And in the video, we saw Anke Manuela Salzman, who is Senior Business and Biodiversity Specialist at Boticário Group Foundation in Brazil. Thank you, Andre and Anke. Andre, we look forward to further discussing with you in the Q&A. Finally, we have 2 colleagues here to share with us how we can successfully scale approaches that benefit both climate, nature, and people. Ineke Naandrup is a project manager at OroVerde, which is a Germany-based tropical forest foundation that addresses the dual challenge of an accelerating climate crisis and the critical loss of biodiversity, and they do this hand in hand with local communities. For instance, with Heidi Garcia, who is social educator at Defensores de la Naturaleza in Guatemala, which combines environmental education, political advocacy, research, monitoring, and climate action to build a sustainable future. Heidi, Ineke, how can we successfully upscale action that delivers both on biodiversity and climate?
Yes, thank you very much, Sander, for this very nice introduction and a very good question that we would like to answer on in a little presentation we prepared. So as we mainly saw also in these videos shown before from Brazil, there are actually a lot of local solutions existing in place that are facing both climate but also biodiversity related objectives. Also in our project Green Watersheds, we are working towards the development but also the implementation of local solutions, here based on the approach of ecosystem-based adaptation. Still, seeing all these global crises or challenges we are faced with nowadays, it does become more and more evident that we do need these solutions on much bigger scale and that we actually need to create a bigger impact and try to find a holistic solution for it. This is why now in the following, my colleague Heidi Garcia and me would like to give you some insights to our project Green Watersheds on possibilities how to create an enabling environment for upscaling actually these local solutions that are existing and that are already facing climate and benefiting climate, nature, and people. In our project Green Watersheds, we are approaching the challenge of local adaptation to climate change actually from different angles. Because we think that you need to create an enabling environment for upscaling those local solutions on multiple levels. So these benefiting conditions are actually required on local level, but also in the context of finance and in the context of governance. So in this, we perceive all these different levels to be actually of similar relevance for a successful upscaling process of solutions that are existing. So in the following, my colleague and me would like to give you, for each of these levels mentioned, one practical example from our project region in Guatemala, followed by some lessons learned that we identified in our project.
First, I would like to share some experience from our project in Guatemala on local implementation. Our project is located in Guatemala in San Jerónimo water basin in the Biosphere Reserve Sierra de las Minas. As you can see in the maps include to give you a quick overview where we are situated. For the implementation of local solution, it was necessary to carry out a participatory process with the local communities and water users. With scientific information and the result of the consultation process, 9 local ecosystem-based adaptation measures were defined, and of which 2 have successful. First, landscape restoration, especially the modalities of reforestation with native species in degraded areas, and implementation of agroforestry systems. And second, protection of water recharge zones as those present key areas for local resilience to climate risk. These 2 measures have been successful because they enhance water supplies in San Jerónimo River. That is especially important for farmers who use irrigation, fish farmers, human consumption of water, and energy generation.
To actually create benefiting conditions on local level, to have a good upscaling process, one key lesson learned that we identified was to actually establish a good communication of benefits and progress of the measures implemented from the beginning on of the implementation process. For this, it's also really recommendable to actually also identify some short-term benefits of the measures implemented, to actually avoid a long-lasting process of not seeing any evident results, but much rather start with something visible and actually measurable and concrete in the field. Then it's also really important to also consider the transformation costs that there are for the implementation of a measure, especially in the agricultural context, because transformation costs are actually a key element for local decision-making, especially on household level. Then it was also one lesson learned from our project implementation that it is actually good to develop ecological and also social safeguards to monitor possible side effects of the measures that are implemented, and also in that way enable adjustment and the further implementation.
For finances, for EBA, to design the financial mechanisms that will be successful, we held a series of meetings with the private sector to understand what motivated them to invest in nature-based solutions. Their answer was, we want to invest in a mechanism that has a clear structure, planned action that contribute to common interest, as well as invest of financial resources from landowners, industry, government, and others. So we created Water for the Future, which is an innovative collaborative platform that promotes nature-based solutions articulating the public, private sector, and society. In this platform, all economic contributions are considered. For example, the national industry sector currently contributes to the implementation of the landscape restoration solution. We have funds from Semaco company for the production of native trees.
So in the context of finance for upscaling solutions, we saw as one very important key step to actually sensitize both sectors, so the conservation but also the private sector, much more for the expectations and needs from the other side, and to in that way also enable or facilitate the cooperation. For this, it's then as a next step good to establish a good communication strategy that is actually adapted to the language spoken by each sector, as also in this regard we have great differences between both sectors. In the then further establishment actually of a finance mechanism, it proved recommendable to actually align it also with national and international targets, and also with private sector CSR to create incentives for further investments into it, and in that way also embed the finance mechanism established much more into the bigger frame that is already existing. Finally, we see it as a key recommendation to actually establish an investment portfolio for ecosystem-based adaptation to in that way facilitate investments into adaptation and specifically for ecosystem-based adaptation.
Governance. To identify fitting governance model for our area, it was necessary to carry out a consultation process of all stakeholders, private landowners, fish farmers, farmers who use irrigation, water committees of local communities, municipality, industry, and others. It was defined to create an association with formal structure, San Jerónimo River Basin Management Associations. We are in the process of legal election of the member to identify common interest and vision for the future. This association will be able to receive funds from the initiative Water for the Future, as well as from other sources, to implement the solutions in the EBA management plan that I already mentioned, and most importantly, the decision-making capacity for good basin governance.
In the elaboration of a governance mechanism for upscaling local solutions, we actually see it as a key step first to identify the common interests shared between the stakeholders involved, to actually at the beginning create a common ground to work on together. For this, it's also helpful or proved to be helpful in our project to create somehow a joint future vision that actually also includes the visualization of the failure to act. So what that would cause specifically for the sectors that the stakeholders involved are working in. As one of the most important and most often mentioned biggest challenges on multiple levels are actually the frequent changes in power positions. One lesson learned was also to anchor knowledge much more on institutional level, to here really try to avoid more the loss of knowledge and expertise. In the longer term process of the work of a governance mechanism, it's also important to constantly observe power relations and power dynamics to really enhance good cooperation between the stakeholders involved and try to keep much more of a power balance in between them in that regard.
And the conclusion, we have learned that the challenge of local adaptation to climate change must be addressed in a participatory manner and on a multiple level where all stakeholders can plan, give their opinion, implement, and invest financial resources for this search for sustainable development by implementing solutions that articulate approach to the conservation of biodiversity and ecosystems. To actually create a bigger impact, we have to establish the right condition on multiple levels to enable the actual upscaling of local solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Heidi and Ineke. So for those joining us through the webcast, please continue to post your comments and your questions on Twitter using the hashtag biodivcc. We have heard from our excellent panel with Alexandra, you setting the stage, speaking on key challenges at the global level to achieve actions that meaningfully contribute to both biodiversity and climate governance. We heard from you, Andy, how monitoring and modeling are absolutely vital to correct our course and to optimize our action. We had Ricardo demonstrating to us how action for people, for biodiversity and climate are aligned, for instance, in the Brazilian Atlantic forest. Then we heard Anke and Andre discussing the business case for nature-based conservation and climate change adaptation. And last but not least, we heard Heidi and Ineke sharing with us the key ingredients for upscaling ecosystem-based adaptation. Now, I would like to open the floor for your questions, and please raise your hands when you have a question that you would like to ask. Please proceed to the microphone over there, and if you could perhaps state your name, affiliation.
Thank you. My name's Kian Minswu. I'm part of the University College Cork. So my question is for Ineke and Heidi at the final presentation. So I thought it was really interesting, this idea of projecting failures. And it seems to me that there might be two reasons for doing this. So one might be motivational. By doing that, you sort of like, okay, well, these are the things we want to avoid. But it could also be important for substantively trying to figure out what actually you want to do. And these are things that we have to avoid, and we have to try to avoid that lock-in. So I was wondering if one of those was more important to you, whether both of them were, or how those actually ended up playing out as an advantageous part of the process. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. I think in our case, it was much more the visualization of the failure to act very much based on scientific data. So there was also very much a recommendation from our partners to use scientific data to really try to show consequences or local consequences of climate change. But I think it was much more used here in what you mentioned first, more this showing the negative results or the possible consequences for the sectors of the stakeholders involved. And trying to create an incentive kind of in that way. But you're totally right that you could use it in different ways, definitely.
Thank you. I see a question. Okay, there. Please proceed.
Thank you very much. Dirk Hoffman, German Institute for Development Evaluation. I have a question first to Andy. You rightly pointed out the importance of monitoring and of modeling. My question, how do monitoring results and monitoring data and modeling results make it to policymakers and make it to the general public? And whether you would see a role for evaluation in this whole setup? Because there is a long way from data and from the two activities you described to really getting things done and having changes put around. And if I may, a second question for Alexandra. I think very, very, very important, the introduction of biodiversity and the discussions on climate change. Would you know whether the NDC process or whether possible discussions on the NDC process is considering this important topic? Because there will be probably future reform to the NDC, to the guidelines, to the reporting guidelines. Thank you very much.
Shall I go first? Thanks very much indeed for the question. So monitoring feels a long way from policy, but actually cumulatively, it's largely monitoring data that were able, that enabled the IP-based global assessment, for example, to make the really strong statements that it did. But I think that models have an easier fit to policy because of the ability to make projections under different scenarios. It was very noticeable when the most recent IPCC report came out that immediately the discussion in all fora really was what are the actions that we need to change the projected outputs from these models from an undesirable projection to a more desirable projection. So that field of modeling has already moved to the point where that's where the debate is. With biodiversity, we're not there yet. There's still a lot of discussion about exactly what the indicators should be. And one of the things that concerns me slightly about the biodiversity process is I think those indicators need to be modelable for exactly this reason. But the models are at a much earlier stage of development, and that's why we need to have a much closer coupling between modeling and monitoring. We don't have what climate scientists had, the long historical time series, which was put together, amazingly and creatively, but did actually exist because of the well-mixed nature of the climate and the relative simplicity in terms of how many variables you need to measure. So we don't have that luxury. The models have to get better really, really quickly, and they'll only get better by using them at scale and monitoring. And then the models will very quickly learn. They will improve, and they'll only become better quickly enough when they're used at scale together with monitoring. And then I think we can get to the same position in the policy debate that we're in with climate.
Yes, thank you for your question, which I think is very important. And just, I guess, to give a bit of context, in the COP25 decision in Madrid, the cover decision does include a mention about the need for integrated climate and biodiversity action. It's paragraph 15 of 1CP25. And so now at COP26, it is really key to operationalize this or go further than this paragraph. So a number of different NGOs and some parties are also considering, or NGOs are pushing for this, and some are considering including some language in the COP26 cover decision. But it's important that that language is not just a repetition of last year, because it's just very general, but that it actually lands into something a bit more operational. And I think this question of inviting countries to better align or insert or make sure that their NDCs, their climate action in the short term and also their planning in the long term integrates these like biodiversity, I guess, boundaries and ecosystem boundaries is very important. But on the specific question of NDCs, I think there has been pushback from countries about too much specific guidance. I don't know about if that will be possible in the future, in future revisions, but also another thing that is key is in the long-term strategies that countries should be developed, or some countries have developed and will continue to do so to, I guess, give some meat behind the net zero announcements. I think making that integration of climate and biodiversity is very essential, because that's where we will see these major potential trade-offs if countries use a lot of carbon dioxide removal and land-based measures. So, but for now, I think at least linking this question of biodiversity and climate really to how we reach the 1.5 goal, and that we need ambitious action on both, would be, for me, a big win in the COP26 decision. Because for the moment, these are kind of still separate discussions.
And Alexandra, I think you just also published a paper on that,
yes.
Right? With
Today?
IDDRI, so do look it up.
In an hour.
in an hour. This is the launching event.
Exactly.
So I think I saw a question over there, and okay. Oh, okay. Do you have a question, please?
So very quickly, I'm Adrian Watson from the youth arm of the Jamaican delegation, representing CSOs, to keep the government kind of accountable. My question is actually between Andy and Alexandra. So you mentioned something about your rocket science in measuring for biodiversity and ecosystem restoration and monitoring, right? My challenge is, it's nice that you've focused on parts of your presentation on Latin America. What about transferring some of those skills to small island developing states that have the same level of biodiversity, but just in lower numbers in terms of population dynamics? And how do you see a role like, for example, your organization and Alexandra's organization transferring some of those skill sets, for example, LiDAR technology, which is rocket science technology really, in my understanding, to young scientists like myself who don't know anything how to use LiDAR and modeling technologies, right? Which pivots back to Alexandra's point a while ago. How do you operationalize this in a SIDS context? Because understanding Brazil, Peru, Uruguay are not SIDS, and SIDS have locked within them important biodiversity at the same scale as larger countries. And how can we use that for ocean services, where most of our natural resources are also locked, using the same LiDAR technology? So the skills transfer, the operationalization, the funding streams, that's where my question is surrounding.
Do you want to go first, or shall I?
Go ahead.
I'm not coughing at the moment, so
okay.
Maybe I should go
yes,
first.
Go ahead.
It's a great question. So one thing that is an enabling thing about these technologies is they are producing truly global data at increasingly high resolution and increasingly freely available. So that there isn't a physical barrier to accessing the data. And I think that another hopeful thing that the COVID pandemic has taught us is that it is possible to teach highly technical stuff without being in the same place as the people you're teaching. It isn't as much fun, it isn't as you know, it isn't as enjoyable for either party and it isn't quite as effective, but it really can be done. And I think that should free up a lot of the cost, the economic cost of having that kind of skills sharing. So I can't speak for my organization in terms of what its strategy on these things would be, but we want to produce the Biodiversity Trends Explorer, which I sort of showed you. That's reporting on every country that's large enough for the currently quite coarse driver data that we're using, but within months we'll have 1 kilometer pixel size. And so that should be enough for the terrestrial side to be helpful to small island states. I know that there are shallow sea monitoring systems that should be sort of similarly helpful. So get in touch and happy to try sharing the skills around what we do.
Yes, well, I guess I will just add, perhaps not on the technological and capacity building transfer, but I think it's really interesting to hear your question coming especially from a small island, because, for instance, it makes me think to the fact that the Eosis negotiating group here, which is very, very strong in terms of pushing for ambition. I mean, a lot of the members are in the High Ambition Coalition that gave a really powerful statement a couple of days ago. But for instance, that statement does not include at all any mention about the key role of biodiversity and of preserving ecosystems to reach the 1.5 degrees. So I think precisely I think Eosis and the grouping of countries under this negotiating group should really put biodiversity, connect these two issues even more, because in the end, even if perhaps large-scale bioenergy might not be a problem, for instance, in small islands, regardless, there is this like very big connection between pushing for biodiversity ambition and pushing for climate ambition. And my impression is that Eosis has not yet fully integrated that, as is demonstrated in the hack statement. Thanks.
Thank you. So I see a question over there. Please proceed.
Yeah, hi, I'm John Kimber from Chile. I'm part of the International Forestry Students Association. My question is to Andy.
Could you, sorry, I'm quite deaf, so I'm just struggling. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, so my question is, how can we include like the native indigenous communities of the different parts of the world into modeling? Because I think they have a bigger understanding than we can ever have by just studying, and they've lived there for thousands and thousands of years. So how can we include their knowledge and their wisdom about their biodiversity and forests into modeling, into all the modeling you do? Thank you.
So, fantastic question. So, I'll answer it, but just firstly, I want to make the point that some evidence for the point of how important they are for biodiversity. In the IP-BEST global assessment, we analysed for those indicators that can be resolved spatially finely enough, then all of those indicators were showing a better status of nature in indigenous land than the global average, and a less negative trend in indigenous land than the global average. Now, that's not true, for instance, in biodiversity hotspots, but it's true for indigenous land. And so, yes, I think it's really important to work with, so trying to work with, to produce scientific indicators that are relevant to indigenous communities. So the one I showed, the Biodiversity Intactness Index, the idea is it's a measure of the multifunctionality of an ecosystem. So how many of the things that you might want is the ecosystem healthy enough to provide? But it's a scientist's view, so definitely would be good. And also in the IP-BEST global assessment, one of my colleagues, Zsolt Molnar, led a survey of indicators of the state of nature from indigenous local knowledge and indigenous peoples and local communities. The first time there'd been an attempt to globally synthesize what indigenous communities worldwide thought about what was happening to the nature that mattered to them, and showed that across the board, the decline for, so about 3/4 of the indicators, if I remember correctly, were showing negative trends. You know, things were getting worse. And that's a set of voices. IPBES was set up to listen to them and reach out to them. And it was a really powerful addition to the global assessment, because, you know, I depend on biodiversity, but I don't depend on biodiversity near where I live, which is a very good job because there isn't very much. Whereas indigenous peoples are living with the biodiversity local to them in a mutualistic way, depending utterly on it. And so they are exactly the people that we need to be listening to as well as we can and reaching out to.
Thank you, Andy. And at that very local level, we've seen some examples also with Ineke and Heidi, for instance, presenting the example of Agua para el Futuro. And you showed us, like, you build a collaborative platform to formulate kind of common interests and do kind of visioning together. So all of this takes place very locally. But, you know, we are at COP26, right? So I was wondering, what role can international organizations play and governments play in enabling and scaling ecosystem-based adaptation?
I think we'd say that especially governments, I mean, if you look at these mechanisms established, like, for example, Agua para el Futuro, like you mentioned, here these public funds could complement the private sector funds that are already in this funding mechanism. No? So here there would be definitely a way to contribute on the way of finance. Additionally, we would see, I think, the role of international organizations here much more as providing maybe a linkage between the local solutions that there are, so much more the level of local implementation, and the bigger frame that is globally existing, also with national or international targets. So really trying to draw more this connection, and here maybe also translate a little bit more between local action and international targets.
Thank you, very clear. Do you want to add something, Heidi?
No.
Okay, thank you. So one thing that also came to the fore in our discussion is the role of businesses, of course. And Andre and your colleague Anke, you have shared the case of Viva Agua and ProAdapta to illustrate how you engage different stakeholders, including companies, by helping them to manage climate risks through ecosystem-based adaptation. So how do you make sure that these actions that companies take not only ensure business continuity, right? Because that is a very clear kind of benefit of these types of actions, but it's also important that they benefit local people. So how do you make sure that it's not only business continuity, but also helping local people?
What we are doing is put together all that companies with the local people that live around the factories and the agricultors that provide some raw material for them, and making some plans to how to develop the area that these people live, and the company use the water and other resources, and executing this plan with monitoring of the communities and the local government too. And the idea is put together the company, the NGOs, and the agricultors, and local groups of producers that work with some specific crops, or some syndicates and people that are living the area and can monitor what is happening there, and give this information for the government and companies too.
Thank you, André. Maybe, is there a final question here? Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Gustavo from CDP Latin America. Thank you so much for your presentation. And a final question to whoever wants to answer. I was wondering what are the key aspects to hold companies to account for their impact on people and planet, especially on biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo. Nice to see you here. So I won't ask everyone to answer that question, but maybe I could ask Ineke and Heidi whether you have a view on that. Like, what is important in holding companies accountable?
So I think that is probably going to the direction of like the mechanism, for example, for investment to invest in for companies, how that mechanism must look more or less, so that there is actually an incentive of financiation. So, and that is something that we also discussed more in our project, is actually what we got there from interviews or meetings from our partner organization, Defensores de la Naturaleza, with different companies in the region is, the need to actually invest into a mechanism that is already existing, that has a clear structure, and where the benefit or the impact is also really clear and kind of pushing a chain of benefits afterwards, where this is really clear also to the companies investing into that. So this is really required, I think, from their side, and also kind of the desire to invest into something into a mechanism where very different stakeholders are involved. So not only one mechanism specifically for a certain sector, specifically for a certain company, but much more something, especially when it's a regional mechanism, something where everyone contributes to and everyone contributes to a larger impact. So that is really something that we were drawing on from our project experience, if that's maybe answering that a little bit.
Thank you, Ineke. And of course, accountability is not only at the company level, but also at the global level. So maybe, Alexandra, you could also speak to that a little bit.
Yes, no, thank you, because I think this question of keeping companies accountable, on biodiversity is also keeping them accountable within their climate commitments, or to ensure that basically the climate mitigation or compensation that they're doing is not hurting biodiversity. And for instance, the G20 countries agreed to phase out coal, and in that they also agreed to promote the deployment of low or zero carbon energy, and explicitly citing sustainable bioenergy. But I think this question of what is sustainable bioenergy is a major red flag for me, because the bioenergy industry has, there are already major negative impacts, and a lot of discussion about how this is sustainable, when in fact there are clear forests that are being cut down for wood biomass companies. And so I think it's really essential that now that this question of coal transition is actually starting to happen, that we're not resolving a problem like the climate change by really creating another one. So I would say that, for me, bioenergy is really a red flag. And what does it mean to be sustainable? And indeed, the IPCC and IPBES workshop report that came out this summer, for instance, did an assessment of what would be the maximum sustainability amount of bioenergy crops in the world. And so I think really taking these already defined thresholds by science into then what companies do would be very important. Sorry.
Thank you, Alexandra. And as we wrap up this session, I would like to ask our panelists to finish the following sentence in 20 seconds for each person. And the sentence is, when we leave Glasgow, I would like to see. So maybe I can start at the very end with Heidi. When we leave Glasgow, I would like to see.
That the indigenous people can have access to implement EBA solution in a way that it is adapted and relevant to each culture.
Ineke.
Well, I hope to see that the commitments that are made here, especially at COP26, are actually implemented and followed by local implementation and pretty much directly followed by local action.
André, please.
The rapid multiplication of multi-stakeholders initiatives around the world, expanding the application of nature-based solutions to increase people's resilience, safety, and the quality of life.
And Andy, what would you like to see?
I would love to see the governments and the media recognize that it isn't the climate activists and the nature activists that we need to be protected from. It's the vested interests that are the climate and nature inactivists that we all need to be protected from. I think that will make progress easier.
I think you agree, Alexandra, but do you have your idea about what you want to see?
Yes, I would like to see anchored in the COP26 decisions a critical, that this COP is really the critical turning point where parties and non-state actors start aligning their climate ambition, mitigation ambition towards 1.5 within biodiversity and ecosystem planetary boundaries, because we can't be treating these two crises as separate anymore, and we need to keep companies and countries accountable on this joint ambition.
Very clear, Alexandra, thank you. So let me express my attitude for our lead partner, IDDRI, from York University, but also our colleagues, Neil Jennings from Grantham Institute and Andrew Denault from the German Development Institute, who have been supporting us behind the scenes, and of course, our excellent panelists, Alexandra, Andy, André, Ineke, Heidi. I would also like to thank our audience, both online and here in Glasgow. Before we leave, let me give a shout out to a follow-up event which we will hold tomorrow at Strathclyde Student Union, as you see on this slide, where we will talk about more about how we can track progress of non-state biodiversity, climate, and adaptation action in the global climate action agenda. So if you are interested, and I'm sure you are, please register and you will receive more information, and we hope to see you there tomorrow. Now, I really hope that you have enjoyed this panel as much as I have, and when we leave Glasgow, for a matter of fact, I really hope that we will see that this event has inspired more action that deliver both on climate and biodiversity, because we can't afford to treat climate and biodiversity as two separate crises. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.